The first Europeans to encounter tea were Portuguese explorers in 1606. Over the next 2 centuries, the West became addicted to its unique flavour, to its hints of luxury and exoticism. In Britain, the desirability of tea was heavily promoted by the East India Company, a commercial empire founded on its trade.
This trade grew to be so significant that although the East India Company was effective ruler in most of India, the net revenues from the China tea trade to the East India Company in 1800 exceeded those of its Indian empire effectively. The East India Company ruled over something like a quarter of the world's trade and 20% of the population of the planet. That's like Microsoft, Coca-Cola, McDonald's and about 20 others rolled into one.
Les Chinois sont quand même d'excellents commerçants et ils profitaient bien évidemment de ce monopole de fait qu'ils avaient en proposant à des prix qui étaient assez élevés et aussi en proposant des quantités assez faibles pour donner un petit peu de rareté à leurs produits. Et donc les Anglais ont eu besoin très rapidement d'avoir une monnaie d'échange aussi, parce que les Anglais ne faisaient qu'acheter des produits aux Chinois, mais les Chinois ne leur achetaient strictement rien.
Really, the only way of paying for tea that the Chinese would accept was silver bullion. The company, could not afford to pay in silver bullion unless it found some means of getting the silver bullion back from the Chinese. Lo and behold, up came the magic solution, which of course was the opium trade.
Aujourd'hui, quand on pense à l'opium, on pense à la Chine, mais ce sont les Anglais qui ont introduit l'opium en Chine.
They started growing opium in India, particularly around Patna, from the late 1750s onwards. This trade developed until some 20, 30 years later, represented something like 5% of the revenues of the East India Company. They didn't actually export opium directly to China, but what they did was sell it for silver bullion at Calcutta auctions to private traders. They turned a blind eye on the fact that the private traders would then smuggle it into China and sell it for silver bullion.
When the British demand for tea escalated dramatically in the early 1800s, the East India Company responded by increasing tenfold the production of opium. The world's most dominant colonial power became its largest opium merchant, and China a nation of addicts.
Because of the ban that the emperor put upon opium in 1838, quite understandably, when something like a quarter of his subjects were supposedly addicted to the substance, that closed down the opium trade and, in its train, cut down or at least debilitated the tea trade, which meant that this vital commodity was no longer as easily accessible to the East India Company and the other companies operating out of Canton than it had been.
In 1839, Britain retaliated by initiating the Opium Wars in order to gain access to tea. The derelict Chinese army proved no match for the might of the British imperial forces. The emperor was obliged to concede access to 5 harbours and title to the island of Hong Kong. The East India Company, though, was still hostage to China's monopoly on tea, which was in short supply. So the company decided to reinvigorate its attempts at growing tea in India. But it did not have China's expert knowledge of cultivation and manufacture, and decided to obtain that knowledge by any means.